Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, rather. We're very pleased to have with us today Virginia Gamba, the Secretary General's Special Representative on Children in Armed Conflict. As you know, the Secretary General's report, her annual report on children in armed conflict is now out and is available. There's a press release is available as well on this. And Ms. Gamba is here to talk to you about this year's report, which will be presented in a meeting to the Security Council next week. Ms. Gamba, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Just making sure I have everything. Yes. And this is all. Thank you very much for being here, and I know there are competing interests always in the UN, as it should be, because we are a global organization dealing with all kinds of crises everywhere in the world. But as you said, yesterday, 7 o'clock at night, we published the annual report of the Secretary General for Children and Conflict covering the year 2024. I'm going to read a brief statement, and then after that we can have questions, if you don't mind. I have time, at least until I think it's 11:30, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So we have time. So good morning. Last time I saw you a year ago, I announced that 2023 was the worst year for children affected by armed conflict since we started monitoring and verifying grave violations against children. Now I'm in front of you a year later, and I am telling you that 2024 was even worse. In 2024, we saw a 25% increase in grave violations against children. This is the third consecutive year with such alarming figures. From 32,990 verified grave violations in 2023 to 41,370 verified incidents in 2024. This is now the highest number of grave violations against children in armed conflict since the inception of the Children and Armed Conflict Mandate almost 30 years ago. The numbers cover the 25 country situations and one regional monitoring arrangement, which are included in the Children and Armed Conflict report. These violations include recruitment and use of children, killing and maiming, rape, and other forms of sexual violence, abductions, as well as attacks on schools and hospitals, and the denial of humanitarian access to children, which are the 6 grave violations against children in armed conflict as designated by the United Nations Security Council. I want to emphasize that the findings of the report were documented amid extraordinary adversity and insecurity. The year 2024 also saw a devastating record of attacks on humanitarian personnel and United Nations staff, with more personnel killed this year than ever before. Wars and armed conflict inflicted excruciating levels of violence on children. As conflicts rage across the globe, children around the world are being killed, maimed, starved, or raped. It is as if parties to war and conflict, and we, the international community, choose to settle our disputes through military means at an enormous cost for our children, rather than choosing to negotiate peace for the benefit of all our children. Indiscriminate attacks, disregard for ceasefires and peace efforts, and deepening humanitarian crisis, with a blatant disregard for international law and the rights and special protections of children by all parties to conflict, have scarred our children for life. Behind the numbers of this year's report are the shattered stories, dreams, and futures of 22,495 children, each of them profoundly affected by war, displacement, and the collapse of protection systems that should have served as their shield. This horrifying number includes 11,967 children killed or maimed as the most prevalent of all violations of 2024. Most often, these have happened because of explosive ordnance, crossfire, and anti-personnel landmines. The use of explosive weapons in populated areas, as well as deliberate and indiscriminate attacks against civilians and civilian objects, had a grim impact. Almost half of all grave violations were committed by non-state armed groups. However, governmental forces remain the principal perpetrators of killing and maiming of children, attacks on schools and hospitals, and the denial of humanitarian access. The second most prevalent violation was denial of humanitarian access to children, with 7,906 collective incidents of denial, and coming a third close was 7,402 children that were recruited or used in the 25 situations and one regional monitoring arrangement on the CAAC agenda, which I oversee. Countries with the highest levels of violations in 2024 were Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory, notably the Gaza Strip, then the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Somalia, Nigeria, and Haiti. Most grave violations showed an increase in 2024, including attacks on schools, 44% increase, and rape and other forms of sexual violence, 35% increase. Here, I want to express my deep concern at the continuous increase in verified incidents of sexual violence against children, as the numbers had already increased by 25% between 2022 and 2023. Data for some countries is particularly staggering. For instance, in 2024, for Haiti alone, over 550 children were victims of sexual violence, with over 70% of these cases involving gang rape. In Nigeria, over 400 children were subjected to sexual violence, including forced marriage. In the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the United Nations verified that over 350 girls were subjected to sexual violence, including rape, gang rape, and sexual slavery. Excuse me. In addition, this year, the number of children victims of multiple grave violations, more than one violation per child, increased by 17% through the convergence of abduction, recruitment and use, and sexual violence, representing an alarming escalation in brutality. The situation faced by children has deteriorated in several contexts, such as Lebanon, Mozambique, and Haiti, which witnessed a sharp increase in grave violations, more than 500% in the cases of Haiti and Mozambique. I want us to pause to think for a second about what this all means. Children living amid hostilities are being robbed of their childhood. We are faced with parties to conflict who, instead of recognizing the special protection afforded to children, are blatantly ignoring international law and show little to no political will. Perhaps nowhere in the news is this more visible than in Gaza. The magnitude of the suffering of the children in Gaza defies and contravenes every human standard. We cannot continue to stand by and watch with no action. There is no justification for depriving children of access to survival means such as food, healthcare, and security. It is imperative that Israel facilitates safe, rapid, and unimpeded passage of humanitarian relief to civilians in need in the Gaza Strip. And it is imperative that the armed groups inside Gaza prime humanitarian relief over their political aspirations, including through the immediate release of all Israeli hostages, alive or dead. The rules of conduct in hostilities apply to each and every party in each and every conflict, and they must be respected and upheld at all times. The children of Gaza dying for lack of essential assistance and life-saving elements will stand as silent shadow witnesses to this lowest degree of inhumanity, which for sure is preventable. The report presented to you must serve as a wake-up call. I call on the international community to recommit to the universal consensus to protect children from armed conflict, and on parties to conflict to immediately end their wars, which are fought over the bodies of their own children. All parties to conflict must uphold the core principles of international humanitarian law that impose limits on the destruction and suffering caused by armed conflict: humanity, distinction, proportionality, and necessity. The report also shows that children are also, in some instances, being re-victimized. 3,018 children were detained for their actual or alleged association with parties to conflict, an increase compared to the previous year. I want to remind you that children released from armed groups or forces should be treated primarily as victims, and that alternatives to detention should be actively sought, with the best interests of the child always in mind. I call on the international community to support age and gender-appropriate reintegration programs as an indispensable element for sustainable peace. Faced with this situation, the United Nations has continued to engage to deliver progress for children affected, and close to 16,500 children formerly associated with armed forces or groups were provided with protection or reintegration support during 2024 in countries on the CAAC agenda, an increase compared to 2023. This brings the total of children released from parties to conflict since 2005 to over 200,000. I want to take this opportunity to emphasize the importance of supporting the release of children from armed forces and groups, but also their reintegration. Releasing children is just the first step, and many steps must follow if we want these children to be given a real chance, a real future. We need to provide sustainable and predictable support to reintegration programs, not only for former child soldiers, but also for children released from detention and for children screened out of recruitment processes. Appropriate services and programs, including psychosocial support, healthcare, education, and livelihood opportunities, are instrumental to successful peace-building efforts. CAAC engagement also bore more fruit for children, and some 40 commitments were taken by parties to conflict, including handover protocols, capacity-building initiatives, unilateral commitments, and bilateral dialogues, as well as the signature of action plans, such as the one with the opposition Syrian National Army that I signed in June 2024. Despite such progress, children have continued to suffer the consequences of man-made conflict in 2024. But this is not a time to give up. We need to redouble efforts and ensure that we have the resources and support to continue to monitor and report grave violations, provide capacity building, pursue accountability, and prevent all grave violations against children. As United Nations peace operations transitions, reconfigure, or withdraw, we must ensure that child protection frameworks are preserved and transferred in accordance with Security Council Resolution 2764. The monitoring and reporting mechanism requires reinforcement and support through predictable, flexible, and multi-year funding. Child protection must be mainstreamed across all mandates and processes, from early warning and mediation to transitional justice, security sector reform, and disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration. Because of the significantly reduced word count, our report unfortunately contains very limited examples of the suffering of the face of these children. We are thus publishing with the report a summary document which includes additional information such as comparisons, information on gender, and individual stories for each of the grave violations. It is an invitation to look beyond the numbers. I invite you to have a look at it. Before opening to questions, let me remind you that my office is working to end and prevent all grave violations against children, and we do that with a wide range of partners, member states, international and regional organizations, DPO, DPPA, and UNICEF, as well as UN agencies, funds, and programs, and their civil society partners. More specifically, I want to stress the crucial work done by child protection actors on the ground, often in extremely difficult circumstances. They often face threats daily in several country situations, and we want to express our concerns and ask all parties to allow them to do their work, which is to provide protection and life-saving aid to children affected by conflict. It is also important that the international community continues to support them. Finally, let me say that beyond the work and efforts of all partners, ultimately, the key to ending and preventing grave violations against children is peace. We must strive for peace. We must compromise and seek peace. We must do this to assist and help our children now. I am ready to take questions, but before I do, I really need to show you a short video about my campaign that the office has launched called Prove It Matters. Can we please see the short video now?
In 1989, you talked about protecting my rights. You said it was important. You adopted the Convention on the Rights of the Child. But it feels worse now than ever before. If this message ever reaches you, we ask you to do one thing. Listen and take action.